having pledged to fix Afghanistan, the good war versus the Iraq war. He had a timeline that included the summer of 2009 election that the military said could not wait. He needed to make a commitment now to start pouring troops in. There was a kind of a bubble of enthusiasm for the power of counterinsurgency to turn wars around after Iraq. So that timeline was then followed by a lot of enthusiasm from the other side of the river about resourcing this counterinsurgency campaign. And the president was very reluctant. As I mentioned, he certainly didn't want to fight a war against the Taliban, but he was, this train was going down the track. And he kind of talked himself into this compromise of allowing the Pentagon, a certain period of time to fight the war, not with all the troops they'd asked for, but with many of the troops they asked for, demanding that they accept a withdrawal schedule before the escalation is even formally announced, which is a kind of a very unusual sort of way to go about it. And one of the things that happened in reality was that I think the president just, by 2010, he didn't believe that this war was going to succeed, and he wanted to end it as quickly as possible. But he couldn't politically, come to full terms with the truth that he didn't think this war, he didn't believe the Pentagon. And so it's not that obviously, it's not that the Obama presidency did not believe in diplomacy or political strategy. And this was, as a Afghanistan, Pakistan person, a kind of a painful discovery or revelation of just putting all of this together. Frustrating, really frustrating, because think about what the Obama administration did in the second term. They completed what must be one of the hardest negotiations, out there with Iran to get them to cap their 10-year program for 10 years. They kept Russia on side, they kept China on side, they worked with the Europeans, they got the Iranians all the way to signature. They decided to reverse, despite political treachery in the United States, domestic political costs, they decided to reverse decades of policy to Cuba. They opened a secret channel, they brought the regional players, they closed the deal, right? So when they put the government all in to a really hard diplomatic political strategy, they could, they had game. Why didn't they do that in Afghanistan? I mean, this was a war where Americans were dying. This was a war, where the stakes were certainly higher than Cuba. You could say Iran was also a very important problem in the world, but I don't know. The Holbrooke issue was one, but I think the exhaustion with the Pentagon, and the inability to kind of take control of the whole proposition from the Pentagon at any stage, even after the drawdown had begun. Yeah.
Anne-Marie Slaughter, New America CEO.
I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter. Hi, Steve. I can't wait to read the book. So one comment and a question. The comment, having seen this up front, up close too, is one of the reasons is that Barack Obama, as the first African-American president, could not afford to be seen as weak. And had he been the first woman president, it would have been the same thing. He was subject to the Pentagon there in a way that he wasn't on some of the other issues. But my question is sort of follows on the first question, which is if Holbrooke had had his way. So Holbrooke's a master diplomat, and he wanted to run this like Dayton, right? And he started with AFPAC, and he had a regional vision, and it really was, at least a plausible vision. So do you think if they had backed him, and obviously it's a what if, but do you think there were the right constellation of people or parties that had any chance of succeeding?
I think the chances were very low, but I think the problem was that you couldn't really test the hypothesis because there wasn't a unified governmental approach. If you brought the CIA to bear on the goal of a successful regional and political negotiating strategy, if you brought the Pentagon to bear, if you coordinated their actions with your political and negotiating strategy, even if it was just regional, and I'm not talking about some Colombia grand bargain with the FARC kind of bow on a peace settlement. I mean, I'm just talking about reducing the violence, stabilizing the war, reducing Pakistan's mischief-making, securing the Afghan population through regional pressure and commitments to violent actors. I mean, even that would it be at least a trajectory towards potential Afghan negotiations to try to find a more stabilizing politics. That's the least that you could do. And but instead you had separate wars being run independently under light interagency guidance and vague goals like reverse the momentum, to such an extent that when, after Richard's death, I guess just before his death, the first meeting with Tayyip Aga is at this safe house outside of the Taliban negotiator. Tayyip Aga is at a safe house outside of Munich. And the Germans are brokering this because they're in touch with Tayyip Aga and they're getting the Americans set up for the negotiation. And the Germans pass a message to the White House, says Tayyip Aga's worried that if he goes to this meeting, you're going to snatch him and put him in Guantanamo because he knows this has happened to some of his comrades before. And so the National Security Council staff goes up to the president and says, you know, this message has come through. He says, well, give him my absolute personal guarantee that's not going to happen. He can come to this meeting, you know, and I will keep him safe. So they pass the message back to the Germans. But then the National Security Council staff says, just in case, let's not tell the CIA about the flight that he's on or the day that it's going, because there could be some list within a list that we don't know about, and he could pop on it, and they could snatch him, and then it would really be bad for us. So, I mean, when I heard that story, I was like, wow. I mean, I guess we should all, just, yeah, be careful out there.
The gentleman in the back.
My name is Nadeem. I'm a journalist with Voice of America. Question to you, Steve. You've talked about the strategies during the Bush administration and the Obama administration. When you compare the current administration's strategy with the previous strategies about Afghanistan and Pakistan, how do you compare? Do you see more clarity? And how do you see things moving forward in Afghanistan?
Well, you know, it's a combination of continuity and change, and I mean, I guess myself, I see more continuity than change. I think there's a little bit of the syndrome that I described, the Obama administration coming in and saying everything the Bush administration did was wrong, we should do the opposite. So there's a little bit of that instinct in this administration as well. There's some things that I can certainly understand, like wanting to be clear about the durability of American commitment to Afghanistan and to undo any sense that we're on a timeline or that there's a date on a calendar. I certainly understand that instinct to clarify that. And you know, the coercion of Pakistan by withholding aid, I don't think is likely to be very effective. But I certainly understand where the frustration has been building up for all these years. You know. But really, I see continuity. You've got a theory of the case that if we drop more bombs, loosen the rules of engagement, stay indefinitely, signal our resolve, resource the two wars that we're fighting, one directly against the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations, the other the advise and assist war to help the Afghan forces. Not that we will win a military victory, because the Trump administration, if you look carefully at what they're saying, that's not what they're saying. They're not saying we're going to fight this until the Taliban surrender. They say we're going to fight them to the negotiating table. And that is exactly what the hypothesis was during the Obama administration. You know, Holbrooke wanted to negotiate right away. Pentagon said, it's too early, let me batter them, we'll get them to the negotiating table. But think about it. We had 150,000 international combat forces in Afghanistan at that time. You know, the best fighting forces in the world. 100,000 U.S. Marines, you know, in Helmand. There's a scene where, you know, Lute says to Obama, he says, you know, Mr. President, you can send Marines to anywhere in the world, and they will clear that area. And if you're willing to leave them there, they'll hold it. But transferring it and figuring out how to find a political solution out of that achievement is a completely different set of questions. And, you know, the idea that you're going to achieve with 10 or 15,000 troops, looser rules of engagement, and aggressive air power what NATO and ISAF did not achieve with 150,000 international combat forces and Afghan partners, I mean, you know, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it. I don't see how you get from here to there. You can hold the achievements. You can protect Afghan urban populations. You can keep the Taliban out of cities. You know, the stalemate is structural. The Taliban don't have an air force. They don't have an answer for the American Air Force. You know, you can hold the ground that has been held for 10 years. But the idea that you're going to coerce a negotiation out of this set of declarations, I just don't see it. I mean, it's my best
David,
judgment.
in the row here, second row. Thank you.
Thank you. Scott Worden, also with USIP. One of the themes that often comes up in lessons learned about Afghanistan, which I don't think made your top 4 list, what I'm curious about is our U.S. strategy toward warlords, particularly after the Constitution and the first election. You know, Karzai has, I think, said kind of consistently, essentially, that he was forced to deal with warlords and internal politics with one hand tied behind his back because we favored certain ones that were instrumental against the Taliban and protected them, so he couldn't go after this in a balanced way. And then the larger issue that we've had is the tension between good governance and balanced politics in Afghanistan as a solution versus our war against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So I guess I wonder, you know, one, from your review and interactions with Karzai, to what extent, hypothetically, you know, if we had had a more balanced approach, do you really think that he would have played that in a, you know, gone after corruption in a balanced way? And then secondly, in the larger picture, you know, to what extent was our kind of schizophrenic relationship between corruption and good governance and prosecuting the war responsible for where we are now?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because it should be number 5 on my list. I mean, it's definitely part of the book. It recurs a lot. This argument recurs a lot. I don't think, to answer your question directly about Hamid Karzai, no, I don't think that would have affected his performance in government positively. But the larger question is one that keeps recurring in both U.S. strategy debates all the way up to 2009, 2010. There's this scene in the Situation Room in 2010 where they're debating corruption, and they have this also kind of super complex, almost like Soviet Politburo type paper about different categories of corruption and which ones can be accepted and which ones can't be accepted. And I think it came out of SRAP's office. Then they get into this convoluted debate, which is basically about, you know, well, it's not just graft. It's, you know, people lifting money out of the aid pipeline and taking it to Dubai. It's also our clients. You know, you keep paying these people, and then the CIA and the rest of the team getting big. You know, Panetta says we've been doing that forever. That's the way we do things. You know, and basically he wins the argument. And so, yeah, it recurs in the story. I think the more, you know, I'm really skeptical about counterfactual history. You know, like if only this, if only that, because it's not really the way the world is organized. But you get tempted into it, right? So. If sometimes, you know, in the week I've been talking about the book, I'm still learning how to talk about the book, by the way. I'm only given that talk a couple of times. But I've been asked, like, was there an opportunity to get this? When was the best opportunity to get an outcome different from the one we have now for Afghans? You know, for all the people we made these promises to after 2001. And I think clearly the answer is the period between 2002 and 2005. And there were so many consequential errors in that time. The biggest one, of course, being to turn and go fight a war in Iraq. And you know, it turns up in the pages with you know, and generals who are sent out to run the first task forces in the summer of 2002. Okay, they're basically terrorist hunting, but they're also meant to reinforce the security that European and NATO allies are providing in Kabul, and light footprint and so forth. But they're taking the mission seriously. They're like, okay, Anaconda's over. We've pretty much chased Al-Qaeda out of the country. Let's talk about how we can consolidate these gains. And the generals go off to a conference in Brussels, and they come back and they say to their colleagues, oh, we're going to war in Iraq. Just got the memo. And everyone is, and of course, in those careers, as in, intelligence careers, you got to go sound a battle. I mean, that's where you go. And so everyone turns in that direction. And Afghanistan is, chronically under-resourced. The second error that was made was to not have a foresightful strategy to reconcile with Taliban foot soldiers and others. Every post-war political environment that stabilizes is shaped by some policy of reconciliation, not with war criminals or leaders. You can decide who you want to hold accountable for crimes of the past, but you can't throw every foot soldier into Guantanamo and not expect a rebound. And we had and there's a chapter in the book called Taliban for Karzai where the CIA, which has more experience with these kinds of things, tries to organize a kind of light program of reconciliation for some of the Taliban. They're all beaten down at this point. They're in Pakistan, they want to come home, they got no resources, and he's trying to organize, he brings it back and briefs it to Washington and gets completely shot down. No, these are all terrorists, we don't do this. And we did the same thing, of course, in Iraq with the Ba'ath Party. So this kind of hubris as the second big mistake. And then, not a mistake, but an achievement, but without protecting it. So that is the consolidation of the Bonn Order after 2002, right? So what a success. Afghans come home. They restore their country. They're coming back. This is not imposed on them. They're coming home. They get through the Loya Jirga. They have a successful, even inspiring presidential election. They have a parliamentary election. They consolidate, and they manage to, solve all these. They consolidate an Afghan state that's being, supported by the international system. Of course, it's a ward of the international system. But the Pakistanis see this across the border, and they start to think two things. A constitutional Afghanistan is being consolidated as an ally of India, supported by the international order and NATO. And around the same time, we go over to India and we give them the nuclear deal. And we come over to Pakistan and we say, by the way, you're not getting one because you're too unreliable. And then we're also off in Iraq, bogged down, struggling, and we turn the whole idea of peacekeeping in Afghanistan over to NATO, right? We cut a deal with the Canadians, the Brits, and the Dutch to come in. So from GHQ's perspective in Pakistan, you've got a state you don't like that's now starting to form and consolidate with international support. You've got a clear decision by the United States that India is its strategic partner looking to the 21st century, and Pakistan is not. And you're looking at a post-American Afghanistan already with NATO peacekeeping coming in for temporary tours and the US bogged down in Iraq. That is when the Taliban come back into action, and I think when Directorate S starts to get serious about being more than just going to their kind of, marriages in Quetta and staying in touch kind of thing, which was probably the pattern in 2002, 2003. After 2005, I think it starts to become, operational.
We have questions in the front here, David. Start with Mark Sageman, former CIA officer and author.
Congratulations, it's a great book. Okay. It really is. But
well, you're in it, so you're not allowed to comment. I'm afraid you're conflicted out.
I'm not going to comment on myself, but it's very different from the first one, from Ghost Wars. And in a sense, it's mistitled. You call it Directorate S, but it really is an indictment of U.S. foreign policy. It's really about the dysfunction, the division among the various stakeholders in the U.S. government, the CIA, the DOD, State Department, the White House. So after you look at that for 16 years, how would you fix it?
Well, you know, you would need, I guess it would be, I mean, the answer is presidential leadership. I mean, the only way to make the best of this sprawling, stovepiped, you know, semi-independent bureaucracy, national security bureaucracy that we have built up, not just since 2001, but since the Second World War, is to be strong and to be in command and to understand how it works and how you have to have a cabinet that will bring you toward the goals that you set. And if you don't, replace those people, because, you know, there are so many centrifugal forces in the system, as you can see, that, you know, even a highly commanding president who's just determined to master this brief and master this opportunity, you know, is going to need a lot of help. And so it's, you know, it's an argument, I guess, you know, as a citizen, I come away thinking, okay, you know, the right kind of leadership and experience, this system will eat up anybody who's trying to learn on the job. You know.
San Abbas from National Defense University, also an author.
Thank you very much. First, thank you very much for your tremendous contribution towards our understanding of the chaos in South Asia and Pakistan and Afghanistan. My question is about Directorate S, or Inter-Services Intelligence. As you have very rightly mentioned about the reasons when I.S.I. started playing a stronger role in strengthening Taliban in Afghanistan. Since then, there was a blowback. And Pakistan, it had disastrous consequences for Pakistan in terms of jihadi organizations, etc., etc. Have you heard of any of the internal debates within I.S.I. or debates about this issue of Pakistan's Afghanistan policy? Because I think there must have been 2 camps or 3 camps, or because Pakistani intelligence and military has not been consistent on many other things. It's surprising to see they have been so consistent for 3 decades on one point, which is a question. And linked to this is, who's the biggest supporter or sympathizer or enabler will be a wrong word, but their friend in the United States? Because there must be some major institution, if it is. Or is it about individuals and lack of cohesion? Or is it that there is some institution, it can be Pentagon, it can be CIA or State Department, somebody who thinks that no, engagement and acceptance of what I.S.I. does, or looking the other way, or having a hope that no, this relationship will bear out, which is the biggest supporter of Pakistan's this strategy within the US institutional system, if there is one? Thank you.
Well, I think after 2001, the CIA really did rely on I.S.I. and the Pakistani security services to arrest al-Qaeda leaders who had fled into Pakistan from Afghanistan. And that, you know, there was the Counterterrorism Directorate, Directorate C, and then there was Directorate S, looking the other way. And Directorate C was quite a good partner of the United States for, you know, the first few years after 2001. And that's where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is arrested, and Ramzi bin al-Shibh, and, you know, dozens of people, not Pakistanis, not crediting this cooperation for the, you know, except for a few leaders of the Afghan Taliban. It was by and large, you know, Arabs, Chechens, Uzbeks, and that was a powerful form of credibility and credit that I.S.I. built up with the CIA and with the whole national security system in those years. And it was credit it then spent to revive the Taliban with impunity between 2005, 2006, and the Bush administration really doesn't come to terms with what's happened. President Bush personally doesn't come to terms with what's happened until 2007, 2008, really, when finally he says, you know, I think, I'm not sure if I got this nailed down enough to put it in the book, but I certainly had one credible account where President Bush says to Hamid Karzai in their last meeting, he flies to Kabul as he's leaving office in December 2008, and he says, "You were right about I.S.I." But it's December 2008. So So I think that's the answer to that question. You know, is there a debate within the Army, within I.S.I. about the strategic alternatives for Pakistan? Yeah, sure, and that's in the story. You know, with Kayani engaged with the Obama administration through 2010, the strategic dialogues. You know, there's chapters that play off of a phrase that was thrown around in the National Security Council, Kayani 2.0, Kayani 3.0. He kept writing, you know, sort of more and more candid white papers about what it was he wanted from the relationship, and that had to reflect his understanding of where the corps commanders would go with him and what he could bring I.S.I. along with. And it was, you know, it was an incredibly ambitious ask list. And you know, it was so ambitious that some of the Americans who, you know, worked on this, I think, read it and said, well, you want a free trade agreement, you know, you want to go back to the civilian nuclear deal, you know, you want us to help you negotiate with India around water access, you want us to address your energy deficits, you want our diplomatic support around your Kashmir agenda, you know, and they said, you know, I can't deliver this. But before that could even, and they were really paralyzed about what to say, because he had at least come forward and said, what would it take to get you to change your conduct, change your whole kind of strategy around this? And he said, okay, here's what it would take. If you could deliver something this robust, like what the Chinese give us, you know, something unqualified and without a lot of bullying attached to it, like if you could give us something like that, you know, let's talk about it. And you know, the Americans looked at it and they said, well, first of all, the next thing that happens is Raymond Davis is, you know, in prison, and you know, Osama bin Laden is dead, and you know, the whole relationship collapses in 2011. So the whole hypothesis that there was a negotiation here never really got off the runway. But partly they were paralyzed and said, well, this is actually not doable for us, you know.
Steve,
So.
doesn't Kayani go to Abbottabad and speak at the military academy, I think in 2010, and make a pretty significant speech saying that our first enemy is the internal enemy? And is that, to what extent, I mean, how do you assess that speech?
Well, I mean, you know, it's the duty of the Pakistani security services to secure Pakistan, and that's what they were. And they were in the middle of an insurgency, and they were, you know, this was a crisis. And one of the things Kayani keeps saying to the Americans when they keep pressuring him, go into North Waziristan, you know, clean this out, finish this off, and you know, he's cautious about that because he's still dealing with cities that are getting rocked, and the Pakistani Taliban, he's not really suppressed them yet. And one thing he keeps saying to the Americans is, look, I've got to fight this internally. I'm having a civil war, right? So I've got to fight this internally so that for my soldiers who are on the front line, it feels like this war is framed as 98% of the country against 2% of the country. If this war becomes 60% of us who are with the Americans against 40% who are with the righteous, our country's going to be in deep trouble. So you have got to give me the space to win my own counterinsurgency, and that means I cannot be seen as your lackey. You know, I can't be seen as basically following your orders, because that's the other side's narrative about who I am. And so, you know, of course he resisted some of this, especially in those years when everything was so hot and so, you know, so violent. And you know, they were taking a lot of casualties. And morale was, they had problems that, you know, they were able to suppress court-martials and things, but they had problems in their ranks about, you know, loyalty and the like. And, you know, now that's changed, you know, so they did, a couple of things happened. To their surprise, I think the Army, and Kayani certainly always thought that we're never going to be able to maintain a large military basing presence in the federally administered tribal areas. You know, that's Indian country. We're up there temporarily. We have trouble moving down the roads. And eventually they said, oh, you know what? We can stay here forever. You guys built some roads and some other things. They consolidated their space up there. And I think as they eventually did carry out the campaign in North Waziristan and did consolidate their security position up there and did push the problem back into Afghanistan, which is what, you know, in effect, after 2015, why is Afghanistan's violence now so much worse than Pakistan's? You know, you could, if you actually did the numbers, in 2009 it was worse in Pakistan than it was even in Afghanistan. Today, it's worse in Afghanistan than it was in Pakistan by significant orders of magnitude. And essentially, the Pakistani army achieved their objective. They suppressed their internal insurgency, and one of the mechanisms they used was to push it across the border.
One other quick question, Steve, about this, with this inflection point where the Taliban start coming back, because you're implying it's largely sort of I.S.I. directed, but is there also kind of a copycatting of the Iraqi insurgency? Because suicide bombings were sort of unknown in Afghanistan, IED attacks, and you see these suddenly spike in 2000.
Definitely, yeah. And there's a chapter about that in the book. You're right. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I don't want to overdetermine I.S.I.'s command and control. They were very, very cautious. They didn't want to get busted in the international system. Even later, when they were clearly, there's some studies of the war American studies of the war that I write about, where, Condoleezza Rice sends out somebody to try to really assess what's going on. But there's this perpetual debate about command and control, the degree of I.S.I.'s command and control, and lots of language that is used, analytical language that draws distinctions between influence and control, and it's a perpetually frustrating debate, but it is clear, I think, by 2006, 2007, 2008, that this is not just passive geographical sanctuary. I mean, there are units forming. Guerrillas are wearing insignia of rank. There are sharpshooters in their units that are training. Their tactical sophistication is not something that they achieved without the support of professionals in the Pakistani system. I think the evidence there is clear.
This gentleman here.
Excuse me, Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, currently Johns Hopkins and the Wilson Center. Just a quick question about the U.S. military. Having sort of been through the Vietnam experience and watched the demoralization of the American military as that war became increasingly difficult, I'm struck by, at least my impression, I spent a lot of time with the military over the last 20 years or so, that the U.S. military in Afghanistan has not been demoralized, that they remain basically positive on the mission. And I find that puzzling. And I wonder if you have a thought on that. And just as a footnote, Zawahri, we find bin Laden, we get rid of him, and Zawahri just disappears from the discussion. I presume he's being sequestered by I.S.I., but I don't know.
Yeah, probably. I'll finish with one story after I answer your question. I think you're right. There's an enormous resilience in this is a voluntary army, obviously, not the Vietnam Army, and now we're fighting primarily, from a posture of 10 to 15,000 troops with special forces, in the lead, and so it's a different equation than Vietnam. And it's a counterterrorism mission against, a notional branch of the Islamic State, which, slaughtered people in the streets of Paris within living memory. And so, it's pretty easy to get motivated to go after that kind of a capacity. And on behalf of Afghans, this generation of Afghans that's come of age in Afghan cities, that, has become, starting to take power in the Afghan government, plugged into the world, on social media, more nationalistic thanks to Pakistan's overreach in Afghanistan than anyone might have reasonably predicted, willing to overcome, to a remarkable degree, the tolerance by Afghans of our screw-ups in their country is, maybe testament to the lack of alternative choices, but also an incredibly, remarkable resilience that is not of our making, it's of their making, and I can easily see why people get attached to defending that, wanting to see it through, wanting to give it some space to succeed, wanting to let Afghans, Afghans are taking the brunt of the war now, they're dying in the thousands, and they're the ones that are fighting on the way. That was the vision. I wish we had a way to provide for them a vision of the future that wasn't about them fighting an endless war that was stalemated interminably. But I can easily see why I share that commitment to trying to find a better way. That's part of why I find myself so candid about and frustrated about our own failures and wanted to put them down in this book in this way, because I think there's got to be a better way than what we have delivered so far, and the cause is a good one. Anyway, I think that's why the morale is there. It's I can easily understand the morale. I just wanted to say something about Zawahiri being in I.S.I. custody. So there's this hilarious account of the negotiations with the Taliban, with Tayyab and with the Pakistan Army leading up to the failure of the office in Doha to open in June of 2013, when it blows up. Karzai blows up the negotiation, then the office blows up, and it's a really not a textbook case of diplomatic success. But one of the things that happens is there's this scene in April 2013 as they're getting ready to kind of close this deal down, and they've got Kayani involved now. So the Pakistanis are, in fact, acting as agents for the Taliban, even though the Taliban always told the Americans, we want to just deal with you directly. But the Americans eventually felt like, we got to get the Pakistanis involved in this. So they've got like some final steps before the office opening, and one of them is that they got to put out a statement under Mullah Muhammad Omar's name that commits him to the terms that have been agreed for this office. And the Americans have drafted this statement for Mullah Muhammad Omar, and basically putting together a bunch of public statements. And they hand it to Kayani and they say, look, these are things he said in public. He should be able to say this for the sake of this statement. Kayani says, okay, well, let me take it to it. Let me see what I can find out. He goes back and he comes back. He goes to Brussels and he walks into this meeting in April 2013 and he's got a statement. He says, okay, this has been approved by Mullah Muhammad. I've made a few fixes. The Americans look at it. It's okay. They can live with it. And it turns out, we learn like years later, that this is the advantage of taking too long to finish a book. We learn years later that on that very day that he handed over to John Kerry the statement in Mullah Muhammad Omar's name that allows the office to open, Omar died of tuberculosis in a hospital in Karachi. So, I mean, I'm not sure that he signed off on the final language, but yeah. I mean, the Americans always said one of the reasons that they were reluctant to tell the Pakistanis about what they were doing with Tayyab, and that made the Pakistanis mad, was because they figured eventually they're going to be negotiating with I.S.I. That any negotiation to end the war is going to have I.S.I. on the other side of the table. And so if they gave them too much information about the U.S. positions, even as confidence-building measures, they were just giving away their negotiating position to the other side, so that they withheld all of that from the Pakistanis. But now you could see that maybe that was probably the right instinct.
Zawahiri?
Oh, Zawahiri. I mean, I just assume that he's dying of tuberculosis in a hospital in Karachi. I don't know. I mean, yeah.
Thank you, Steve, for a brilliant presentation.
Okay.
Steve will sign books after
Okay,
this.
thank you.